Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Kiorkof, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're going to be continuing Strength of Schedule Week as we talk about the strength of schedule at the wide receiver position going into the 2020 fantasy football season. For those of you who are familiar with the channel, we always talk about strength of schedule during the regular season on a weekly basis to give ourselves an upper hand or an advantage to kind of determine which wide receivers have the most advantageous positions based on the coverages they are going to be facing on a given week. Now, we're not talking about week one at this moment in time, but we're talking about the entirety of the 2020 season and what the potential holds for some of these players and who we could potentially be targeting based on their upcoming schedule that could eventually lead to their ultimate success. So we're going to talk about that. I'm going to give you guys my breakdown overall of how I calculated the upcoming strength of schedule, because it is very difficult. Last season I would have just given you guys the schedule of what 2019 had and put it in 2020 schedule and said, we're good to go, ship it. But this year I took my time, I did my due diligence, I broke down a lot of numbers, and I went ahead and I believe I've collected as much data as I possibly can to give us the best look of who has potentially the greatest strength of schedule overall going into the 2020 season. Now, before we begin today's video, let me remind all of you, Andrew Kiorkof's Fantasy Football Draft Guide is now available. For those of you who are looking to find that, information is down in the description as you can see on screen. It is available now. You can also find it on patreon.com/Andrew Kiorkof, where we have a lot of other stuff going on, weekly rankings there, unlimited questions, community Discord, in which we do mock drafts, talk on a daily basis, etc. But either way, for those of you who are interested, you can check that out down in the description. All right, so let's go ahead and let's talk about the wide receiver strength of schedule going into the season. Now, again, like I mentioned a little bit before, I would have typically given you the chart on the right of me and said, you're good to go, this is what we can use. But honestly, this is not the greatest way of determining a strength of schedule going into the 2020 season. Now, what we have to the right of me is overall from weeks 1 through 16 of the 2019 season, how defenses performed against opposing wide receivers on average in a half PPR scoring format, showing that the Tampa Bay Buccaneers were the worst secondary against opposing wide receivers last year, giving up on average 36.79 points per game. Really, pretty ridiculous, right? You always wanted to play against Tampa Bay last season because their secondary was just an absolute mess. So we keyed in on that. Now, on the opposing side, on the very bottom of the list, we have the New England Patriots, which they were the best secondary last season, only allowing 19.22 fantasy points per game on average in a half PPR scoring format. Now, sure, I went ahead and I, regardless, entered this ranking list into the 2020 schedule. So if you played against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers this upcoming season, you were given a 1 on your schedule. If you were playing against the New England Patriots, you got a 32. I added those numbers up. I divided by 16 to kind of get an average of what exactly your strength of schedule was based on last year's performances of defenses as a whole. Now, obviously, like I mentioned, this isn't the greatest way of determining an overall strength of schedule for 2020 because though this list here anticipates what teams did last year, it does not take into account the new players that they drafted, the new acquisitions in terms of free agency, or the players that they could have cut. This doesn't take into account that Earl Thomas just yesterday was released by the Baltimore Ravens, or a player had gotten injured, Achilles injury gone. This is not the best way of determining strength of schedule, but I wanted to go ahead and show you guys this because, again, once and for all, this is something I would have done in the past, and now that we're going into the 2020 season with more experience, with more data, we can go ahead and actually take a look at what can we potentially anticipate going into the 2020 season, which we'll do at this moment in time. Here we go. All right, now that we finally have the legitimate statistics on screen, everything that I've kind of put into this offseason, the stats that I've broken down, and all the numbers that I've kind of computed in order to determine the real strength of schedule at the wide receiver position going into the 2020 fantasy football season, I'll go ahead and bow out here and explain to you guys how I calculated everything and what we can anticipate this upcoming season in my breakdown. All right, so as you can see on the very left side of the screen, this column with the Atlanta Falcons on the very top and the New England Patriots on the very bottom, from 1 through 32, this is the grade average of every secondary in the National Football League going into the 2020 season. I took all 5 grades of all 5 starting secondary members of every defense going into this coming season. So the 2 starting cornerbacks, the two starting safeties, and the nickelback or slot corner, depending on what you call it. Regardless, I took all those grades in terms of coverage, added them up, divided it by how many players are in that secondary 5, and got these player averages. So I ended up finding that the Atlanta Falcons have the worst secondary going into the 2020 season, while the New England Patriots, not a surprise, have the best secondary going into the 2020 fantasy football season on average per player in the 5-player group on defense. Now, I went ahead and I did exactly what I did with the prior chart with this. If you play against the Atlanta Falcons this upcoming season, you are granted a 1 in your schedule. If you play against the New England Patriots, you're granted a 32. You fill out the entire schedule, you add it all up, you divide it by the number of games that you play, and we end up finding ourselves with the middle bar, the true wide receiver strength of schedule for the 2020 fantasy football season, where we have the Pittsburgh Steelers with the easiest strength of schedule at the wide receiver position, and the Buffalo Bills on the very bottom with the most difficult strength of schedule for the wide receiver position. Kind of giving you guys my thoughts immediately. It's great to see that the Steelers are on top because I do think that Juju Smith-Schuster can have a comeback season. But again, if the Steelers are on top, there's got to be another team in their division that is on top as well. We find the Ravens and the Cleveland Browns also in the top 4. The AFC North has an incredible schedule in terms of this upcoming season for the wide receiver position. I understand the Cincinnati Bengals are far lower. They play a couple of different games that kind of throws it off overall. Either way, that's something nice to see. You can go ahead and invest in these kind of wide receivers. They have some potential this upcoming season. But before we talk about specific wide receivers, I want to go ahead and mention the last bar on the very right-hand side of the screen. We end up seeing the fantasy playoff strength of schedule. So this goes ahead and gives us the anticipated strength of schedule for weeks 14 through 16, and which teams have the most advantageous positions in terms of players against secondaries for your fantasy football playoffs. Which guys that you could rely upon down the stretch. We have the Houston Texans, Pittsburgh Steelers once again on the very top, but then again, you have the Chargers, 49ers, and Chiefs. While on the very bottom, the Los Angeles Rams, the Bills, and the Washington football team could potentially be struggling in this upcoming season's fantasy playoffs. But before we continue and I start talking about specific players, I wanted to hop back on screen and give you guys my objective thoughts on the matter. You should not look at this strength of schedule and believe it's the end all be all. Like I talked about yesterday with the running back strength of schedule, there are players that are matchup proof. And guys like Julio Jones specifically. Julio Jones is on the thumbnail, but not because he has an easy strength of schedule like he did last season, but because he has one of the more difficult schedules this upcoming season. And so does Deandre Hopkins to that fact. Just below me right here, the number 29 and 30th most difficult strength, some of the most difficult strength schedules are held by two of the best wide receivers in the National Football League. Do I believe that's going to hurt them overall in their fantasy capabilities? No. These are matchup-proof blue chip players that are on a weekly basis going to produce regardless of the corners on them because of how good they are. Sure, a guy like DeAndre Hopkins has to face Richard Sherman twice a year, Jalen Ramsey twice a year, Jamal Adams with Shaquille Griffin probably bracketing him twice a season. But I do not think that that's going to impose so much of a deficit on DeAndre Hopkins' total season that you should be avoiding in this upcoming year. That is not the case. This chart is not to give you an idea of who to avoid, but who to go after. Because again, strength of schedule is not the end-all be-all, but we want to go ahead and key in on opportunities that we can take advantage of. Sure, we want to go after guys with more advantageous schedules, but we don't want to avoid guys that are in the bottom half. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. But either way, I'll bow out again. And let's go ahead and start talking about specific players and their upcoming schedules this season. Starting off with the number 1 and 2 easiest schedules for the Pittsburgh Steelers and the Baltimore Ravens. And we'll go ahead and throw the Cleveland Browns in there because they're all in the same division. It's great to see the potential that Juju Smith-Schuster has this upcoming season. Again, I do think he could have a comeback year. I do think that there's a potential for OBJ to have a comeback year. But of course, he's kind of a little bit expensive in fantasy, so at the right value. But a guy that a lot of people are talking about, or maybe a lot of people aren't talking about, he's kind of being whispered about, Marquis Brown. Sure, a guy like Mark Andrews is probably the number 1 receiving option of the Baltimore Ravens this upcoming season. Regardless, Marquis Brown has a lot to offer. And if him and Lamar Jackson can connect on one of the easiest strength of schedules this upcoming season, I think the sky's the limit for this kind of guy. I mean, Marquis Brown is one of the fastest wide receivers in the National Football League. We've seen him have explosive games. Is he going to have that volatility? I don't know. That's what scares me about him. But if he can have a schedule in which he's consistently producing on a weekly basis because of how easy it is for them to just feast on secondaries, I think this is going to be a great thing for him. Another team, the Dallas Cowboys with 3 wide receivers that are coming off the board within the first 36 wide receiver picks of your draft. I mean, that in itself kind of says a lot. Amari Cooper, Michael Gallup, CeeDee Lamb are going to feast this year along with Dak Prescott. On top of it, another player that was on the thumbnail, we had Kenny Gallaudet, because again, Kenny Gallaudet does not have as much experience as a DeAndre Hopkins or a Julio Jones or a Michael Thomas, but I don't think he's 100% matchup proof. But this in itself, the fact that he's going to have an easier schedule gives me more ease in terms of picking him in the second or third round, depending on where he falls to me. Trust me, I've seen some crazy stuff. And also on top of that, the fact that Marvin Jones can go ahead and feast in this offense with an easier strength of schedule. We have the Giants with an easier wide receiver strength schedule. Sterling Shepard's the lead guy there. This kind of helps Daniel Jones overall. But then you have Devontae Adams. You have the Carolina Panthers' DJ Moore. You have Keenan Allen, DJ Chark, Michael Thomas with the top 11 schedule, and an AJ Brown. All in all, this top 12 schedule of wide receivers, these are great players. They're going to have the benefit or the extra advantage of playing against secondaries and corners that are just not up to par in comparison to them. So that in itself kind of grants them a pretty good advantage. Now, to kind of look at the disadvantages, sure, the Kansas City Chiefs are at the very bottom of the list. They have had one of the tougher schedules in past 2 seasons, and that's not a secret. But that's because they have to play against teams in their own division that are relatively strong in terms of their secondary. The Broncos are a great secondary, and the Los Angeles Chargers are a great secondary, which you can see on the very left-hand side of the screen in terms of their average grade per secondary position. Overall, that is why they end up this low. But the 4 teams that are all in the same division that kind of share this bottom half is the AFC East. We have the New England Patriots, the New York Jets, the Miami Dolphins, and the Buffalo Bills all sharing this bottom half. The bottom 6 teams, 4 of them are from the same division. Now, they all play each other twice a year. And we know that the New England Patriots have one of the better secondaries. The Buffalo Bills have had one of the better secondaries in the National Football League for a couple of years now with Tre'Davious White, Micah Hyde. They've built something there. And the Miami Dolphins are on their way to potentially having a better secondary. They went and signed the Dallas cornerback. They still have Xavier Howard. They're trying to improve their secondary overall in comparison to what they were last year, giving up the second most points to opposing wide receivers. They've made strides. This upcoming season, these teams are all playing each other twice, and they still on top of that have a tougher schedule in the teams that they all play similarly. Because again, the way that schedules work in the National Football League, if your division mate plays a team, you're likely going to play them that upcoming season to kind of keep everything fair. But regardless, looking at this overall, there are some players that I like that are sitting in the middle of the pack. Like, sure, Chris Godwin, Mike Evans. They have the 19th easiest strength of schedule this upcoming season. Big whoop. They're matchup proof. They've got a GOAT at quarterback. I'm not worried about it. The whole point is, what are the players that we can potentially key in on that are being ignored or being undervalued that could have a great strength of schedule and could lead them to success? Juju Smith-Schuster, Marquis Brown, potentially a guy like Jarvis Landry. He always gets a bunch of targets. And on top of it, the Seahawks are up here. Adam Thielen at 40. There are going to be players that, based on their strength of schedule, benefit a lot, while others, matchup proof, they don't have to worry. And then others, like the Buffalo Bills or the Miami Dolphins, those receivers are going to be up against it this upcoming season. Either way, hopefully this kind of gives you a brief understanding of what we have coming down the line this upcoming season. Thank you, everybody, for watching. I'll pop up on screen to thank you guys again for the continuous support. I love the great comments down below. I really do appreciate the kind words. All of you guys coming out and praising. I do appreciate that down in the comment section on the running back video. If we can get this video to over 100 likes, beautiful. It really doesn't take much. Just click the like button. It helps me out a lot in terms of getting more exposure and having others find these kind of videos to help them out this upcoming season. Either way, thank you everybody for watching. I really do appreciate the support. The 2020 season is just about around the corner. We're gonna get there. We have a lot coming down the pike in terms of content. Probably tight ends tomorrow, quarterbacks the following day in terms of strength of schedule. Either way, thank you everybody for watching, and until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.